In a time characterized by gunfights, cattle drives, and the gold rush, the Wild West was more than just the stuff of legends. It was a setting where basic survival often took precedence over luxuries like hygiene. Yet even in this rough-and-tumble environment, people still found ways to maintain some level of cleanliness and sanitation. Today, we'll delve into some of these specific hygiene habits that were common during the Wild West and shed some light on how our forebearers managed their health and cleanliness in a challenging context. Join us as we have a look at 15 examples of hygiene habits during the Wild West. Number 1. Personal grooming and soap usage. Personal grooming and soap usage during the era of the Wild West was guided both by necessity and the availability of resources. Contrary to the popular image of dusty and unkempt cowboys and settlers, many people in the Wild West did make an effort to keep themselves clean. Soap was considered to be a basic necessity, even if it wasn't always easy to come by. Most frontier households made their own soap by using animal fats and lye, which could be obtained by leaching water through wood ash. This homemade soap was typically unscented and a far cry from the diverse array of fragrant and specialized soaps that we have today, but it was effective for cleaning both the body and household items. Hair care was also formed as a part of personal grooming. People would use their soap to clean their hair whenever possible, and though the practice was infrequent, for many brushing was a primary method of keeping their hair in reasonable shape. Brushes and combs were common amongst personal items, often crafted from materials like wood, bone, or even metal. Personal grooming in the Wild West was far from the elaborate rituals that many of us are accustomed to today, but it was a necessary aspect of life that was adapted to the conditions and resources that were available at the time. The aim was practicality and efficiency, making the best use of what was available while maintaining a level of cleanliness that kept people healthy and socially acceptable. Number 2. Community bathhouses and bathing practices. Community bathhouses and bathing practices in the Wild West presented an interesting dichotomy between communal cleanliness and individualistic frontiersmanship. While many settlers and cowboys on the move had limited opportunities for personal bathing, community bathhouses became popular in more established towns. These establishments would offer hot baths, a luxury in a time when heating water at home was labor-intensive and costly in terms of fuel. Bathhouses commonly had large tubs, often made from wood or metal, filled with hot water heated by wood-burning stoves or coal fires. Many would offer soap and towels as part of the bathing package, essentially providing a one-step solution for personal cleanliness. Despite the rough-and-ready nature of life in the Wild West, the existence and popularity of community bathhouses underlines the human desire for cleanliness and social interaction. It serves as hubs of both hygiene and community life, offering settlers and travelers alike a touch of comfort and civilization in an otherwise harsh and unforgiving landscape. Number 3. Laundry and clothing care. Laundry and clothing care in the Wild West were essential aspects of daily life that contributed to the overall sense of cleanliness and well-being. Due to the scarcity of water in many regions and the labor-intensive nature of washing clothes by hand, laundry was often a communal or family activity that was reserved for specific days. Soap, made from animal fats and lye, similar to the kind that was used for personal grooming, would be employed to clean clothing. Washboards, typically made of wood with metal or glass scrubbing surfaces, were commonplace, and people would use them to scrub out stubborn stains and dirt. The process of doing laundry was laborious. Clothing was soaked and agitated in tubs and buckets, scrubbed on washboards and then rinsed, and finally, it was wrung out by hand or with the help of a wringer if available. Since water was often in short supply, especially in arid regions, the rinse water would sometimes be saved for other purposes, such as watering the plants or even for cleaning floors. Drying was typically done outdoors, with clothing hanging on lines and spread over bushes, and in wintertime, or in bad weather, it may be hung indoors near a stove or a fireplace to dry. In the challenging environment of the Wild West, laundry and clothing care were communal activities that brought families and neighbors together. Though labor-intensive and often hampered by scarcity of resources, these practices were vital for maintaining a semblance of cleanliness and social respectability. Number 4. Dental care and oral hygiene. Dental care and oral hygiene in the Wild West was a rudimentary process compared to today's standards, yet it was essential for maintaining overall health and comfort in a time when dental professionals were scarce. For the average settler or cowboy, dental care usually began and ended with a toothbrush, or, in its absence, a chew stick that was made from twigs with frayed ends that could scrub the teeth. Toothpaste was virtually non-existent in its modern form, but people made do with what was available. A common practice would be to use baking soda or even plain table salt as an abrasive to clean the teeth, and for those who had access to it, charcoal was also used to polish the teeth and help remove stains. It wouldn't be until the late 19th century that dental care began to evolve into a more organized profession, and even then, many of the dental practices we take for granted today were years away from becoming commonplace. However, the significance of oral hygiene was not lost on the people of the Wild West. They recognized the role that it played in overall health, particularly in an environment where bacterial infections could rapidly turn fatal. Though rudimentary, their dental care practices reflected an understanding of hygiene's importance and were adapted as best as possible to the conditions and resources at hand. Number 5. Shaving and barber services. In the Wild West, shaving and barber services held a distinctive role, functioning not only as a means of personal hygiene, but also as social venues where men could gather together, gossip, and discuss local events. For many men, facial hair was more than a stylistic choice, it was a practical concern. Full beards and mustaches were common, partly because they offered some protection against the harsh elements such as wind and sunburn. However, shaving was still a frequent practice, especially for those who found facial hair uncomfortable or impractical for their work. The barbers themselves had to be skilled in a variety of grooming tasks. In addition to haircuts and shaves, they often performed minor surgery, pulled teeth, and even applied leeches for medicinal purposes. Hygiene in these establishments would vary widely. While some barbers prided themselves on clean instruments and fresh towels, others were less meticulous, increasing the risk of infections and disease. All in all, shaving and barbering services in the Wild West went beyond the simple concern for appearance. They were integral to the social fabric of the time. Though the options for grooming and hygiene were limited by today's standards, they met the practical needs of daily life while also serving as important social gathering spots. Number 6. Sanitation facilities and outhouses. Sanitation facilities and outhouses were vital components of public health in the Wild West, especially as settlements grew into bustling towns. The basic form of sanitation was the outhouse, a simple wooden structure with a hole cut into a plank of wood, situated over a dugout pit. These outhouses were usually positioned some distance away from homes and community water sources in order to minimize the risk of contamination. Often built by the homeowners themselves, they varied in complexity from simple holes in the ground covered by a wooden shack to more advanced systems with seats and even multiple compartments. Maintaining an outhouse required regular attention. The pits would fill up over time and had to be either emptied or covered with soil and then a new pit dug. Lime would commonly be used to mitigate the smell and accelerate the decomposition of waste, and despite the unpleasant nature of the task, it was a necessary one for maintaining community health, particularly as improper waste disposal could lead to the spread of diseases like cholera or dysentery, both of which were a significant concern during the era. Overall, while not sophisticated by today's standards, the sanitation facilities and practices of the Wild West represented a pragmatic approach to waste management. These methods were adapted to the limitations of the environment and resources, emphasizing the importance of basic sanitation in the collective well-being of frontier communities. Number 7. Sanitation facilities and outhouses. Sanitation facilities and outhouses were also rudimentary but essential aspects of community hygiene during the days of the Wild West. The typical outhouse would be a small freestanding wooden structure located away from the main living quarters and community water supplies. The hole over which it was built served as a receptacle for human waste, and lime would often be thrown in to control odor and accelerate decomposition. As the hole filled up, it was either emptied or simply covered with dirt, and a new hole would be dug for a relocated outhouse. Although an outhouse was primarily a functional structure, some took extra steps to make the experience less uninviting. A corn cob or pages from a catalog would often serve as makeshift toilet paper, and some outhouses even had windows for ventilation. In more well-to-do homes, the outhouses could be a two-seater, offering a semblance of luxury or at least a convenience for family members who needed to use the facilities at the same time. The outhouses and sanitation facilities of the Wild West were far from glamorous, but they were a necessary part of life that people took quite seriously. Through communal efforts and a practical approach to waste management, frontier communities were able to maintain a modicum of hygiene, which was vital for their survival and well-being. Number 8. Food preparation and preservation. Food preparation and preservation were critical aspects of hygiene in the Wild West, especially since the lack of modern refrigeration and preservatives made food spoilage a significant concern. Meat would often be salted, smoked, or dried in order to extend its shelf life, and in the absence of refrigeration, perishable foods like dairy and certain vegetables had to be consumed quickly or processed into forms that were less prone to spoilage. Things like cheese and pickles. Salt was a precious commodity not only for flavoring, but also for its preservation qualities. People would rely on canning, a technique that had been refined during the 19th century, in order to store their fruits and vegetables for long periods of time. Foods would be cooked and sealed in airtight jars, often with the addition of high-acid substances like vinegar in order to prevent bacterial growth. Cleanliness in food preparation was crucial, not only for immediate well-being, but also for long-term survival. Given the limited medical resources and the harsh conditions of frontier life, an outbreak of food poisoning or waterborne disease could have a devastating consequence for a family or even an entire community. As such, even with their limited means and resources, the pioneers of the Wild West developed practical methods for food preparation and preservation that prioritized hygiene and longevity. Number 9. Hand-washing protocols. Hand-washing protocols in the Wild West were a blending of common sense and traditional wisdom, molded by the harsh realities of frontier life where water could be scarce and a soap a luxury. Yet the understanding of the importance of clean hands was generally acknowledged, especially before eating or after engaging in activities that were obviously dirty, like handling of livestock and performing manual labor. Although the germ theory of disease had not yet been fully accepted or understood by the general public, there was an intuitive grasp of the correlation between cleanliness and health. Hand washing was not only a personal habit, but often a community concern. Settlements located near reliable water sources would generally have better hygiene practices, which contributed to overall public health. The importance of hand cleanliness was sometimes preached by community leaders, which included religious figures who saw physical cleanliness as a component of moral integrity. While hand-washing practices during the Wild West era may appear rudimentary when viewed through the lens of modern science, they represented a pragmatic approach to maintaining health and hygiene, and these protocols, informal as they were shaped by the available knowledge and resources, demonstrating how even under challenging conditions, people took steps to adapt and protect their own well-being. Number 10. Feminine hygiene practices. Feminine hygiene in the Wild West was a complicated affair that was shaped both by necessity and the availability of resources. Due to the limitations of the era, lack of running water, absence of disposable products, and limited medical knowledge, women had to be resourceful and practical in managing their menstrual cycles while maintaining overall feminine hygiene. Cotton, wool, and linen rags were often used during menstruation and were washed and then reused. These materials were folded or stitched into a manageable size and held in place by specially designed belts or simple pieces of string. After use, these cloth pads were typically washed in hot water and soap, then dried in the sun, and capitalizing on the sun's natural sanitizing properties. For general feminine hygiene outside of menstruation and childbirth, women used a variety of methods for cleansing. Homemade soaps crafted from lye and animal fats were common, and in some instances, women employed natural botanicals with antibacterial properties in order to assist with cleaning. Vinegar would be a common item used for its cleansing properties, sometimes diluted with water for a less harsh application. Feminine hygiene practices of the Wild West were dictated by the conditions and resources of a harsh and often unforgiving environment, and while not sophisticated by today's standards, these methods were the result of real-world practicalities, coupled with the prevailing understanding of health and cleanliness at the time. It was a testament to the resourcefulness and resilience of women during the era, who adapted their circumstances to maintain as much hygiene and dignity as conditions would allow. Number 11. Pest control measures. Pest control measures in the Wild West were a mixture of resourcefulness and ingenuity, driven by the need to protect food supplies and health. In a time when modern pesticides and traps were not readily available, settlers had to make do with what they had. Mice and rats were common pests that could not only damage food stock, but also spread disease. A common way to deal with these rodents was through domesticated cats, which were a popular presence in many homes and barns for that reason. In some cases, mechanical traps baited with food would be used, although these were rudimentary compared to today's traps. Another significant concern was the prevalence of lice and fleas, both on humans and livestock. One method for dealing with these pests on the human body was the use of a fine-toothed comb, while a more extreme measure would include shaving off bodily hair. For clothing and bedding, boiling and sun-drying were the most common treatments. Livestock were sometimes treated with solutions of tobacco water or other homemade concoctions that were believed to repel or even kill fleas and ticks. And even with these measures, pest control was a constant battle. It was understood that failing to control pests effectively could lead to the spread of disease, contamination of food supply, and overall discomfort. As communities grew and markets developed, some commercial solutions began to appear, which included early forms of chemical pesticides and more effective traps. But for most of the Wild West era, people relied on a combination of traditional wisdom and practical measures that were shaped by their environment. It demonstrated their adaptability and resilience in the face of hygienic challenges. Number 12. More pest control measures. Pest control in the Wild West was also a constant challenge that required a blending of traditional wisdom, resourcefulness, and improvised solutions. One common approach to rodent control would be the domestication of barn cats, which were highly valued for their ability to keep mice and rat populations in check. For those who could afford it, mechanical traps would be another option, although these were usually simple in design, requiring regular attention to be effective. Beyond flying and crawling insects, settlers also had to contend with fleas and lice. These parasitic insects were not only an annoyance, but could also carry diseases. Basic grooming practices such as using a fine-toothed comb were employed to manually remove lice from the hair, and clothing and bedding was frequently boiled and exposed to sunlight to kill any lingering insects. Some people used plant-based repellents like extracts from herbs known to deter insects to treat both their homes and their livestock. Pest control during the Wild West era was a matter of practicality and continuous vigilance. The techniques were necessarily straightforward and based on available resources and shared knowledge. Although they lacked the synthetic chemicals and specialized equipment available today, the settlers of this era applied a keen understanding of their environment and the behavior of various pests to maintain as sanitary a living condition as possible. Number 13. Waste management systems. The complexities of waste management were especially felt in the developing towns and settlements of the Wild West. The primary approach to human waste would be the outhouse, a simple wooden structure placed over a dug hole. These outhouses were strategically located to minimize contamination of water sources, though the effectiveness of this technique could vary. The waste collected in these pits was occasionally used for fertilizer, though more often it was simply covered up with soil. Household waste, such as food scraps, was usually given to livestock or composted. Trash like cans, broken glass, and other non-biodegradables were often disposed of in communal dumps on the outskirts of settlements. In some of the more large and organized communities, there were even rudimentary attempts at garbage collection and removal, but these were far from being systematic. Burning was another method for disposing of both household and garden waste, but the smoke could cause respiratory issues, and the fire was a hazard in itself, especially in dry conditions. Despite these challenges, the importance of waste management was generally recognized, driven by the grim reality that poor sanitation could lead to outbreaks of life-threatening disease like cholera and dysentery. In an era where infant mortality rates were high and medical knowledge was limited, childcare and infant hygiene in the Wild West was a matter of the utmost importance. Cloth diapers made from available fabrics like cotton, linen, and wool were the norm, and these were washed, boiled, and then dried in the sun for reuse. For feeding, breastfeeding would be widely practiced due to its convenience, hygiene, and the antibodies that it provided to the infant. When a wet nurse was unavailable and alternative feeding methods were needed, cow's or goat's milk would be used, and any vessels employed were sterilized through boiling. Bathing infants was a delicate operation. Water had to be warmed over a fire or stove, and the actual bathing was done quickly to minimize the child's exposure to the cold. Herbal infusions, such as chamomile, were sometimes added to the bath water for their perceived health benefits. In the absence of commercially manufactured baby wipes, soft cloth or natural sponges were used for cleaning during diaper changes. Utmost care was taken to keep the baby's living environment as clean as possible in order to minimize the risk of infection. The common wisdom and practices surrounding childcare and infant hygiene were handed down through generations and shared with communities, often supported by the advice of older women who had served as the repositories of communal knowledge. Number 14. Handling sickness and disease. The challenges of handling sickness and disease in the Wild West were compounded by a lack of medical knowledge and access to healthcare facilities. The most common diseases included influenza, tuberculosis, and dysentery, as well as waterborne illnesses like cholera. Isolation would be the primary means of preventing the spread of infectious disease, and those who fell ill were often separated from the community in makeshift quarantine spaces. Homes would sometimes hang colored flags or signs to signal a sick individual inside. Herbal remedies were used, which included teas made from plants like willow bark, known for its anti-inflammatory properties, or mint for digestive issues. If the situation would escalate, a doctor would be summoned, though this was often a luxury, and these physicians would usually carry a medical bag with a limited arsenal of treatment. This included rudimentary surgical tools and a few pharmaceuticals. Bleeding would be a common but misguided treatment, as was the use of whiskey for a range of ailments. Despite these limitations, community members would band together in times of illness, sharing both practical care and traditional remedies. And in a land where physical labor was the norm and medical help was often miles away, wound care and first aid were critical skills. Minor injuries would be treated with basic first aid, which could include hand washing the wound with soap and water, if available, and then applying a cloth bandage. For more severe injuries, tourniquets, made from available cloth, could be used to stem heavy bleeding, and hot metal or fire may be employed to cauterize a wound. Alcohol, usually whiskey, would serve multiple purposes in wound care, such as being a disinfectant, an anesthetic, and sometimes even a surgical aid. For broken bones, rudimentary splints made from wood and cloth were employed to immobilize the limb until proper medical help could be sought. Herbs with purported medicinal qualities were also commonly used. For example, plantain leaves were sometimes applied to wounds for their believed antibacterial properties. In the absence of modern antiseptics, boiling water would be used to sterilize instruments and dressings, and the overarching philosophy was to make do with what was available while trying to minimize infection and further harm. These improvised methods were the forerunners of first aid practices that we consider to be standard today, illustrating once again the resourcefulness necessitated by life on the frontier. Number 15. Water purification and consumption. Access to clean water was a pivotal concern in the Wild West, given that waterborne diseases like cholera and dysentery could ravage a community. Various methods would be employed to ensure the safety of drinking water, each with its own set of challenges and effectiveness. Boiling was one of the most straightforward and effective means of purifying water, killing off most harmful bacteria and parasites. The water was then often cooled and stored in clean containers for use. While boiling would be effective, it was also time-consuming, requiring a heat source, which made it impractical for those who were on the move. Rainwater was generally considered safe to drink and was collected in barrels or other containers, but the issue with rainwater would be availability. As many parts of the Wild West would suffer from sporadic rainfall and drought, stored rainwater could also become a breeding ground for mosquitoes if not properly covered, and that presented a whole other set of challenges. In cases where water quality was uncertain, alcoholic beverages like whiskey would often serve as a substitute, particularly for adults. Alcohol's antiseptic properties would offer some protection against bacteria, although it would also present its own set of health risks. Water purification and consumption was a multifaceted challenge requiring a blending of knowledge, caution, and often compromise.